Hey everyone, it's Allie, and today we're going to be talking about Falconeer. Falconeer is the final mastery that we've been missing in the last epoch, and it's finally been revealed. And honestly, I think Falconeer looks pretty interesting. Falconeer is going to offer two unique playstyles that haven't really been available in last epoch before, and I think both of them are going to be really fun. And I think they're going to offer you completely new gameplay that really hasn't been seen before. The thing that makes Falconeer different from everything else is, well, its namesake, the Falcon. Pretty much whatever you plan to do with Falconeer is going to involve your Falcon in some sort of way. And the nice thing here is that the Falcon that you're going to have, if you pick Falcony, is going to be immune to all damage, meaning you never really have to worry about your pet suddenly just randomly dying and then you losing half of your mastery just because it's dead, or deal with any other annoying minion mechanic. And because of this, it's honestly going to feel like a really interesting playstyle simply because a lot of Falconeer is focused around either buffing your Falcon or your Falcon buffing you or you playing together as a team. And realistically, I think this is going to feel very much like a two-man party. And it's going to differentiate itself from a minion build by pretty substantial margins simply because you're either going to be having your Falcon give you buffs and be your support, or you are going to be the support for your Falcon and your Falcon's going to be the one that shines. The other really interesting thing that Falconeer is going to add is traps, which is something we haven't really seen before in last epoch with this much support into it. And between nut traps, I think we have some really cool new I think we have a really cool new playstyle that, if it is supported properly with enough uniques and with enough supports all over the place and with enough supports on gear, I think are going to both be very powerful. Now, if you do want to play Falconeer, and anything that you see here is currently not available in game as we are still currently in beta 9.1, but the game is going to fully release on February 21st, and Falconeer and all of the other masteries that have been showcased over the past few weeks are going to be live on launch. So if you do want to play the Falconeer, it will be there on February 21st. The first skill to talk about here is going to be the namesake of the Falconeer itself, Falconry. This is going to be a two-part skill. A part of it is going to be passive, which is going to give you a permanent Falcon pet with you at all times. And the second part is going to be an active skill, which is going to make your Falcon go out and do a bunch of attacks depending on how you set it up. There are going to be a few different nodes on its passive tree that are going to change what it's going to do when you do use your active. And in my opinion, I think it's going to be a really neat skill that can either be its own build, where you can buff your Falcon to do all the work for you, or you can have your Falcon support you by giving you buffs and potentially even have it be an augmenter to other previously existing builds. So the first interesting portion I want to talk about is going to be a top left portion of the tree. We can then take Partoken, which is going to make it so every time you throw an acid flask, your Falcon is going to regenerate a charge. This means that with 4 points in Partoken, every time you throw an acid flask, your Falcon is going to get an acid flask charge back, meaning this effectively doubles the damage of acid flask. Not only that, but this acid flask is going to scale with your gear and your stats and your acid flask tree, meaning that is just a free doubling of its effectiveness. Now, playing Acid Flask as a poison build, in my opinion, isn't going to really make too much sense here, simply because the points leading up to all this, Falconeer's Mark, makes it so every time the Falcon hits an enemy, it's going to mark them. And when you hit that marked enemy, you are going to deal effectively double damage against the target. And because of that, it's not going to apply to poisons, meaning that playing this as a poison build is not going to be as effective. But if you were to play, for example, a fire crit based version of Acid Flask where you convert everything over to fire, it's going to work really well, especially since we can pick up Tempered Glass on Acid Flask, which is going to make it so our Acid Flask has a chance to Armor Shred. And then if we go over to the right and swap over to Explosive Flask and then pick up Smolder, all of that Armor Shred is going to turn to Fire Red Shred. And this is also going to apply to our Falconeer's acid flasks, meaning we are going to get a large amount of fire resistant shred very quickly, giving us a large amount of damage, especially when we combine it with something like Piercing Debris, which gives us substantially more critical strike chance and critical strike multiplier, allowing us to play a very strong crit based build. The other interesting thing here, Marking Strikes, which is a point that we'd have to pick up before we can pick up all of this Acid Flask synergy, also makes it so your Falcon's other hits, which would include the Acid Flask itself, can apply Falconeer's Mark, meaning that you aren't going to put yourself in a weird position where you need to stop throwing acid flasks so your Falcon can auto attack to apply the marks. You instead can just throw acid flasks to your heart's content, meaning that you don't have to do anything weird. You just simply play the build as an acid flask build. And the final little bit of synergy with all this would be picking up Wake of Winds, which is going to make it so every time you consume the mark, it's going to give you an additional increase to movement speed and attack speed, meaning that you're going to overall feel a lot faster. Now, the other interesting way of playing the Falcon is as a DPS build by itself. Now, one thing I want to mention about your mastery as a Falconeer is that your Falcon just gains raw damage equivalent to your dexterity. And you also get a hefty chunk of dexterity to get you going, as well as having plenty of dexterity on the rest of your passive tree. First, we have Falconeer's Journey, which gives us both 1% more damage per level. So at level 100, this is just doubling our Falcon's damage, as well as 1% more damage per point of dexterity, which just further double dips with all of the other damage increases that we have for a Falcon. The other really nice thing about this, with it being a minion skill and it potentially might being a little bit clunky with getting it to do whatever we want, we can either pick up Psychic, which makes it so it attacks whatever we've recently attacked, or we pick up Watchful Eye, which makes it so it attacks anything near us, meaning we just keep running forward and it's always going to focus on the things around us rather than it going and attacking something off screen. In terms of making the damage, in terms of scaling this into potentially a dot build, that could also be really easily done through Rending Talons, which makes it so any of your ailments or shred or any sort of things that you might apply as debuffs to enemies, your Falcon can apply for you at 200% increased efficiency. So if you have a 100% chance to ignite, suddenly your Falcon has 200% chance to ignite, meaning it applies 2 stacks every single time. You could also then make it into some sort of throwing build where you can scale throwing and then have it affect your Falcon through both the passive tree and through points such as Feather Knives, where your Falcon will just spam Feather Knives, which has a 10-second cooldown. And then we can pick up Sky Chaser, which makes it so any of your throwing attack speed is applied to your Falcon at a massively buffed rate, meaning that it will effectively basically just be able to spam Feather Knives all over the place, which gives it really good AoE, as otherwise the Falcon kind of just dashes around and only attacks 1 or 2 targets at a time, where the Feather Knives instead will just make it have really strong AoE. Finally, to add on to all of this increased damage for a Falcon, we can pick up Train to Hunt, which is going to make it so a portion of your damage, whether it's your melee damage or throwing damage or your bow damage, is then going to apply to everything your Falcon does. And this should include all of its dot damage, meaning we can now turn increased melee damage, for example, into increased poison damage if that's a kind of build we would want to play a Falcon. Overall, I think between these two different playstyles of turning your Falcon into a throwing base build or turning it into an acid flask base build, I think Falcon overall has a lot of supports. And even if you don't want to use it for something like that, you'd always just use something as simple as picking up Falconeer's Mark. So it gives you free extra damage on your hits if you just want to use it as support. And then, for example, maybe go over and get Bird of Prey, which is going to make it so your Falcon, when you use its ability, is going to execute monsters for you, giving you a little bit of utility in terms of killing off bosses. I think overall the skill is pretty neat. I think it has quite a lot of potential in terms of being a very strong skill. Moving on next, it's time to talk about Explosive Trap. Now, Explosive Trap is the other thing I'm very excited about in Falconeer, and I think this is going to allow for quite a lot of really interesting builds to be played, not only as just Falconeer, but other masteries as well. The really neat thing here to take into consideration with all this is that Explosive Trap only requires 5 points to be put into Falconeer, meaning that both Marksmen and Blade Dancers could pick up Explosive Trap, and this is not a Falconeer exclusive skill. Because of this, we can abuse some of the ways that you'd want to play this build on other classes instead of just specifically playing as a Falconeer. Now, there's going to be 3 different playstyles that I want to showcase here that I think are going to be really interesting. First off would be going to the left. What going left would do is we would get arrow traps. And what this does is every time we throw an explosive trap, it's going to detonate and cast a detonating arrow for us. Not only that, but all the fire res shred stacks that we'd get, which we'd have to pick up, can then be turned into lightning res shred stacks through static mines, which also converts the damage of the traps themselves, meaning that the lightning res shred stack would also apply to the mines themselves and to all of your detonating arrows. Now, personally, I think if you'd want to play a detonating arrow setup for your traps, you'd most likely want to use this as a marksman to be able to benefit from all of the extra bow damage that marksman has to offer to be able to scale your detonating arrow. This could effectively be seen as a way for you to throw a lot of traps at once, especially if you would go over to the right and pick up something like cluster traps, which allow us to throw 3 traps at once, meaning we effectively have triple attack speed. And what you could do for the detonating arrow is pick up the point on detonating arrow's tree that makes it so it's free, meaning that you only have to pay for the explosive arrow costs. And because of that, it would be much easier for you to deal with the increased mana costs of taking clustered explosives. Now, if you don't want to play just a lightning based build, you can also pick up Trappas. And what Trappas does is it's going to throw a different explosive trap for each type of conversion you have picked up. That means if you have static mines, it's going to throw a lightning trap and a explosive trap. And if you decide to pick up cold snap mines, it's also going to then throw a cold snap mine on top of it. This could be pretty interesting if you just want to apply a bunch of ailments, and it could potentially give you overall more damage if you just want to throw a large amount of different traps at once. A really fun point, which personally I don't really see how you'd include right now, I just want to mention it because it's really cute and really fun, is both Hold This and Aspect of the Rabbit. What Hold This does is when you attack an enemy with a melee attack, you attach an explosive to that enemy. That explosive is going to take a little bit longer to explode. And if you were to pick up Aspect of the Rabbit, every time that the enemy attacks you, the trap is then passed back to you. What this does is you're effectively playing hot potato with the trap. Now the trap will never damage you. It just explodes. It just explodes and deals damage to enemies only. But with Aspect of the Rabbit, you gain 30% more damage with the trap every time you pass it back and forth. I just think it's really cute that they added in hot potato with the trap, and I think it's really fun. I just don't personally see a place you take this, especially for something like a boss, where bosses don't really auto attack that much. But it's kind of cute, and I really like that they added something like that. The other really interesting thing you'd want to do with this is to potentially go for Trap Sprinkler and for Automated Bombardment. What this would do is it would make it so every single time you throw a trap and it goes off, it would then throw a fresh new trap. Now, we don't exactly know what Automated Bombardment's going to do. It specifically says it throws a fresh explosive trap, meaning that the trap could potentially just keep refreshing itself infinitely. Now, this doesn't mean you get infinite damage because you can only have 6 active traps at once with explosive trap. But that would mean that once you do throw 6 explosive traps, they would permanently just keep rearming themselves over and over again, either consistently reprocking whatever they're doing in the case of arrow traps, throwing more and more detonating arrows, but we'll have to actually see how this works in game. The other really interesting thing here to keep in mind would be Trebuchet, which makes it so that any explosive traps dropped by Trap Sprinkler are now instead flung at nearby enemies. This means that you'd never have to aim, and this effectively gives you good AoE coverage, as your traps will just immediately spread around as needed. The other cool thing here is Instrument of the Alchemist, which makes it so it throws acid flasks. This could potentially combine with the Falconer, and you could have some sort of setup where you throw yourself explosive traps that then throw acid flasks that then make your falcon also shoot out acid flasks. It might be a kind of cute playstyle, but I don't really think that's going to go anywhere. I think you're adding too many extra steps to the whole playstyle. But I really do like this whole playstyle of your traps consistently retriggering themselves. Now, the final thing to mention here, which I think is so strong that it's going to potentially give you a whole new playstyle by itself, and that is siege engineering. Every time you throw an explosive trap, every time an explosive trap detonates, you now have a chance to spawn a ballista. With some other support throughout the rest of Falconer, which would allow us to gain extra damage per in scaling, we could potentially have some sort of in stacking explosive trap ballista setup that could potentially be extremely broken. The final thing I want to talk about explosive trap here, which I think is going to be really neat and I think is going to be very strong, is going to be taking Blast Rain. Now, Blast Rain, what Blast Rain does is it makes it so you, instead of throwing the traps, you now shoot them from a bow and they come down and explode on impact. And they come down and explode on impact if you were to pick up Impact Trigger. I think this has the potential to be a really strong build, and from the little bit of B-roll that we've gotten of it and the showcase we've seen of it, it seems like it could potentially be a really, really interesting way of playing a trap build, where instead you're playing a bull build, which would mean that your detonating arrows would also scale even further from you being a marksman. I think together, these might give you a really strong setup, and we'll see where Explosive Arrow goes. It's a little bit weird that Explosive Arrow personally seems really good for other classes and doesn't really have much synergy with Falconeers themselves, other than the whole Ballista synergy, because Ballistas are technically minions and Falconer has a decent amount of minion support. But outside of that, the only thing that you really have for your Falcon and your Falcon damage is Sky Signal, which makes it so every time your explosive traps detonate, your Falcon deals 15% more damage for 3 seconds, and this stacks an infinite amount of times. I don't really think you'd probably want to sit there and spam explosive traps, especially since there's no real other supports that would give you any sort of utility from spamming this. But you could potentially play it as a acid flask build where you're taking up Instrument of the Alchemist, which is then going to give your Falcons a lot more damage, which is then going to make it so the acid flask that they drop give a lot more damage. But I think that's kind of pushing it. I don't really think there's enough synergy to warrant a playstyle like that. Next up, we have a really interesting utility skill that could potentially also just be a very strong build on its own. We have Net. So Net does exactly what it says it does. You just throw a net, and if the enemy is a normal enemy, it's going to get completely mobilized. And if it's a boss, which is a really interesting thing here, it's going to have 35% less movement speed, which is really strong as slowing bosses is a little bit difficult, and it might be really nice to be able to slow them down. Now, nets can be played in a plethora of different ways. You can use it as a way to buff yourself through things such as leading the hunt, which is going to make it so you deal 10% extra damage against enemies that are slowed, as well as being able to pick up quick throws, which is going to make it so you have global increased attack speed every time you actually gain the increased damage against slowed enemies. And at the same time, you could pick up nodes such as Entangled Weapons, which is going to make it so enemies deal 12% less physical damage against you, which is a great defensive layer. And Weakened Threads, which is going to make it so you immediately get 3 frailty stacks, which is going to make it so enemies deal 16% less damage to you. Just between all of that, the net is going to have quite a lot of really good synergy. And I think those nodes by themselves makes it a really, really strong utility skill. Now let's talk about how to make this net do damage, because yes, we can make the net do potentially quite a lot of damage. The first option we have is going over to the bottom left of it and picking up Barbed Net, which makes it so the net itself deals damage over time, as well as the points before it, giving it a chance to bleed. The interesting thing here is going to be potentially picking up Acid Snare, which makes it into a poison build if you'd like to play this as a poison build instead. And the node all the way at the end, Trapper's Crescendo, is going to give you 1% more damage per 100 dodge rating. Now, this is a completely new way of scaling a build. We've never had some sort of dodge stacker before. This would be a really interesting way of scaling Net's damage, simply because this will also allow you to have a lot of defenses through having a lot of dodge rating. The other really interesting way of making this potentially into a bleed build and making this into a damaging build is to instead go down to pick up Bolt Throw, which makes it so your net doesn't move you around anymore, as well as pick up Net Trap, which just turns into a trap skill. And then finally pick up Spear Trap, which is going to make it so your Net Trap now also uses Puncture for you when it's triggered. Now, the interesting thing here is that you could either play as a melee skill or a bow skill. It doesn't matter. It'll do either version of Puncture. And the nice thing with this is we can pick up Sever of Tricks, giving us 2 additional net traps per throw, meaning that we effectively do 3 punctures per attack. What we can then do with all this is scale quite a lot of throw and attack speed and scale quite a lot of bleed damage, and then have a really interesting puncture, throw, bleed build, which could potentially be incredibly strong. The other way to potentially make this into a damaging build is by going Trickster Artist, which makes it so every time you use your net, you're going to drop caltrops at your starting location. You can then also pick up Tinker's Combo, which is going to make it so the caltrops are dropped at the targeted location, which means that every time you throw your net, you can benefit from all the utility of it, while at the same time being able to pick up caltrops, which we currently don't exactly know the tooltip of, and we don't know how strong they are. But from all of the B-roll that we've been showing, they look to be some sort of bleed-based skill where we can apply quite a lot of bleeds with it very, very quickly. We could also instead make them a hit-based build where we pick up Silvered Spikes, which gives us a 1% base crit chance per 10% slow chance. And the nice thing about this is that there is other synergy that also increases the damage of this through some of the other skills that we have access to. So speaking of those, we should talk about Aerial Assault, which is the said case. Aerial Assault is going to be a Falconeer's main mobility skill. There's going to be a dash forward, and the thing I hate about this is that it's going to require you to have a target. And as we've seen from Templar, their mobility skill lunge does feel a little bit bad, needing to have a target be selected, but in most cases it should be fine and it shouldn't really feel too bad to use. Now, the interesting thing about Aerial Assault is that we can turn it into a very, very strong skill overall. So to So to add on to all the caltrop synergy that we've been talking about for net, we can go to the bottom left portion of the tree and pick up Treacherous Pursuit. This is going to make it so the aerial assault itself, when the falcon drops you off, you're going to throw a bunch of caltrops. And the points behind it, both Vengeful Nails and Rending Barbs, are going to apply to all caltrops that you have, period, no matter where they are. Vengeful Nails is going to increase the hit damage of it, so if you want to play it as a crit build, it's going to have great synergy with that from nets, simply due to it also giving you a lot of slow chance, allowing you to really benefit off of the slow multiplier that it had. And the nice thing here is that because you picked up these points as aerial assault, that means you have extra points for net to be able to pick up other useful things. Rending Barbs, on the other hand, is going to give you a lot of bleed chance for all of your caltrops, no matter where they are. And the interesting thing here is if an enemy walks over the caltrops, your falcon's hit gain additional bleed chance per 4 dexterity that you have, and this can stack an unlimited amount of times. That means that you could potentially do some sort of caltrops bleed build where you also have your falcon, and your falcon is also going to gain whatever bleed chance you have at 200% ratio, meaning that it will also apply a lot of bleeds. And with all this, you can then further give your falcon even more bleed chance simply because you're going to be stacking dexterity pretty heavily as a falconeer, overall allowing you to add quite a lot of bleeds onto a target very quickly. The other really interesting ways that we could play Aerial Assault could potentially be with something like Twilight Strike, where every time we end the Aerial Assault and we do the Wing Burst at the end of it, we drop Umbral Blades, and these are going to use your skill tree for whatever you have in your Umbral Blades. Now, the only thing I don't like about this is that Umbral Blades is very much a Blade Master skill and very much a Blade Master build. And unfortunately, Aerial Assault is going to be Falconeer only, as you're going to need to go pretty deep into the Falconeer tree to be able to pick it up, and it's not available to any of the other masteries. So I personally don't really like Twilight Strike too much, as it doesn't have too much synergy. And the other thing that I really like about Aerial Assault, which I think is probably going to give us a completely new build playstyle, is going to be Tactician. Now, previously with Explosive Trap, we did talk about how the Explosive Traps can summon ballistas for us, which is great, given that ballistas are kind of annoying to move around and summon, especially since we can pick up Cluster Traps, which makes it so we throw multiple traps, which means we summon multiple ballistas at once. We can then pair with Aerial Assault and Tactician, which makes it so our ballistas gain 2% more damage per point of intelligence that we have, as well as gaining 75% increased attack speed. This together is going to give us so much extra damage for ballistas that's going to make them honestly pretty cracked. Ballistas were kind of weak and they didn't have too much support between items up until this point. But if we were to play some sort of Falconeer, where we took both Tactician and we took both Explosive Traps and use Explosive Traps as our way to move our ballistas around, we get a lot of intrinsic scaling for ballistas, which could potentially make them unbelievably strong. And I'm really excited to see where people go with this if it does manage to turn to a whole build. The final thing to mention about Aerial Assault is going to the bottom right of it. The interesting thing here is going to be Aerial Prowess. For the next 8 seconds after using the skill, your crits are going to give you a stack of Aerial Prowess up to a maximum of 36 stacks. Now, these stacks, the next time you use Aerial Assault, is going to increase the damage of it by quite a lot. But honestly, what we really care about here is picking up Tormented Talons, which is going to make it so our non-crits are also going to be able to give us a chance to get these stacks, so we don't have to necessarily play it a crit build. And then pick up Terror Wings, which is going to make it so using our ballistas, Explosive Traps, or Dive Bomb is now going to consume the stacks and apply the damage from them, which is 2% more damage per stack, to those skills themselves. I really like this because that effectively means your playstyle could be something like use your mobility skill, attack a bunch of times. Those attacks are going to give you a bunch of stacks. And then you could potentially just use a Dive Bomb or an Explosive Trap or something to massively increase the damage of it. I think overall, Aerial Assault is a pretty interesting traversal skill. And I think just because the caltrop synergy and just because it can potentially make ballistas really strong, that's going to have a place in some Falconeer builds. And overall, it just seems to feel like a really smooth mobility skill, other than the fact that you specifically need to target it. I wish there was a point in here that allowed you to just use it wherever you wanted, rather than you having to specifically target an enemy. And then finally, we have Dive Bomb. Now, Dive Bomb is going to be a skill that has a decently long cooldown that's going to make your Falcon go up in the air and do a really big hit. Now, Dive Bomb, Now, Dive Bomb, I think, is not going to be too strong of a skill by itself in terms of the damage it's going to do, but I think it's going to be a really interesting utility skill because you can either turn it into a mobility skill by picking up Valkyrie, which is going to make it so you also leap to where you're supposed to dive bomb if you have a spear equipped. And because you can pick up something like Talon Blades, which makes it so after you which which makes it so anything hit by dive bomb and anything that gets hit by Featherfall, which is a extra ability that happens every time you dive bomb, you are going to get stacks of Talon Blades, which give you quite a lot of increased crit chance and increased crit multi. Now, there is counter synergy with this if you were to play it as Valkyrie, for example, because as soon as you press your dive bomb, you're going to lose all your stacks. This would be kind of something where you only press once every 18 seconds and just leave it be so you can gain as many, so you can have the crit chance for as long as possible. The only other really interesting dive bomb use case I can see would be with a Caltrops build. With the potential synergy of us playing both Net Trap, which would give us a lot of punctures, as well as us being able to play Caltrops, which would then also give us even more bleeds on top of all of it, assuming that Caltrops are still going to be dropped by our Net Traps. That means that we're going to have quite a lot of bleed stacks being scaled very, very quickly on whatever we're fighting, especially when we combine it with the synergy from Aerial Assault, giving us even more bleeds and giving us our Falcon even more bleeds. That we could potentially pick up Exsanguinating Strike, which is going to make it so the hit damage of Dive Bomb is going to be increased by 1% per bleed, as well as it immediately eating up all of our bleeds and doing one really big hit. This might be really cute, and this might be really interesting as a way to add a lot of bleeds to an enemy very quickly, then consume all of them, then add a bunch of bleeds really quickly, then consume all of them. But unfortunately here, it doesn't give you any extra damage with the bleeds. It just makes them do all of their damage instantly. So unless you had very, very long duration bleeds, this wouldn't really do much for you. As a 2 or 3 second bleed, just being able to instantaneously do damage, especially when Dive Bomb has a 7-second cooldown, isn't really that impactful. You could potentially pick up things such as Rush the Hunt, which reduces the cooldown of it by 40%, as well as picking up Rapid Pursuit, which makes it so it has 36% additional cooldown recovery if you hit an enemy, if you hit a boss. So you could potentially just build up a bunch of stacks and then have 2-second dive bombs on bosses, allowing you to very quickly eat up those stacks. But I don't think it's going to be too strong. And I really wish that Exsanguinating Strike did have some sort of more damage multiplier for the bleeds that did eat up to make the synergy even higher. I think between a puncture net setup, a throwing falcon setup, and potentially some sort of acid flask setup, Falconeer is looking to have some really fun and really interesting setups. Falconeer is looking to have some really fun and really interesting builds that we haven't really seen before, and I'm glad to see a fresh new take on a minion skill. I think I like this a little bit more than Necro because it's trying to do something different than some sort of generic minion build where you kind of just forget your minions are there and you kind of just don't really do anything while your minions do all the work for you. And instead it's trying to make some sort of companion setup where you are either helping your Falcon and you are scaling your Falcon to do all of your damage for you, or your Falcon is helping you gain increased damage for whatever build you want to play. I like that even though it's called Falconeer, it's not necessarily just a minion build, and it seems like it has a lot of synergy for other interesting builds and a lot of synergy for just playing a sort of generic bow build setup. And I think it's going to be quite a lot of fun. I think it's going to be really, really interesting for the people that want something a little bit more than just a generic bow build or just a generic minion build. The final thing I want to talk about is if you are liking the way Falconeer looks, or if you're just interested in Last Epoch in general, you can go to the pre-order website and buy yourself a copy of the game right now. There are quite a few different packs if you'd like to support the game a little bit more. Or if you'd like, you can buy it on my Nexus store instead. It'll be the same thing as if you pre-ordered it or bought it on Steam, except I will get a tiny cut of it and you will just get a Steam key, which you can go and redeem on Steam. And if you just want to support your local e-girl, I would really appreciate it if you buy it on Nexus store. Other than that, I think Falconeer is going to be really cute. I think it's going to be fun for the people who want to playstyle like this. And if you have any questions or want to discuss Falconeer further, I'll be more than happy to do so with you in the comments below. Lastly, if you want to watch me play Last Epoch, or if you want to discuss with me any of this on my stream, I stream every single day, and I'll be streaming Last Epoch all the way up until the launch of the game, and for about a month and a half past the launch of the game until the next Path of Exile season starts. I will definitely be trying a Falconeer build for myself later on into the season. I don't think I'm going to be playing this on launch because I think Warlock just looks way too interesting for me. It's a playstyle that, and Warlock is offering a playstyle that I personally am going to really enjoy. But I definitely think later on the season, I'll most likely try some sort of net bleed build simply because that looks really interesting and it looks really fun and potentially very strong. Other than that, I hope you cuties enjoy the video and I'll see you all in the next one.